thoughts. We're just waiting for one more presenter here, so give us one moment. All right, Jennie and Juliann, I just promoted her.
Hey, this is Rebecca. I think I might have made it.
Yay. So if you can turn on your video, we'll see you. Awesome.
All right.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming to the last day of CALM. We're so happy that you're here. My name is Jennie Cook. I'm one of the co-organizers of the conference, and I'm pleased to welcome you to The World is on Fire, Weaving Compassionate Leadership into Crisis and Change Management. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our amazing colleagues from Colorado. So thanks so much for presenting with us.
Hi, happy Friday, everybody. I hope you are all doing well, and thanks for sticking with us through the end of this week. We're happy to have you. So we wanted to start things off just first of all by introducing ourselves and talking a little bit. We're each just going to briefly say what compassionate leadership means to us. I'm Juliann Couture. I am the head of the William M. White Business Library at the University of Colorado Boulder. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And for me, compassionate leadership is about providing a safe and supportive environment and recognizing the role that one's work plays in one's life. And I think it's also, for me, about really considering the systems and structures at play and how to interrogate those.
Right. So hi, everybody. My name is Jennie Gerke. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Associate Dean of Success and Engagement Strategies at the University of Colorado Boulder as well. I think for me, one of the big things about compassionate leadership that I think a lot about is that people are more than just their job. That I think often when we're thinking about ourselves at work, we are thinking about ourselves as like within that space, but everybody brings what comes from outside, and compassionate leadership helps allows you to bring your whole self to work.
And I'm Rebecca Kuglitsch, also use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am the team lead for branches and services at the University of Colorado Libraries. And when I think about compassionate leadership, kind of the pithy way that I think about it to myself is that I'm not the main character in the story, that everybody who is here in the libraries who is working is the main character in their own stories. And it's my job when I'm there to make sure that they can flourish as best as possible. And so the next thing we wanted to do was an acknowledgement for where we are today. So we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses and the lands that we are presenting from today are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge that the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. And we want to recognize and affirm the ties these nations have to their traditional homelands and the many Indigenous people who thrive in this place now, alive and strong, and contribute to our society. And at the same time, we also acknowledge the painful history of ill treatment and forced removal that has had a profoundly negative impact on Native nations. We respect the many diverse Indigenous people still connected to this land. We honor them and we thank the Indigenous ancestors of this place.
I need to remember that I was just on mute. We wanted to start by having you all share with us things that you are most wanting to learn, but also sharing what maybe you're struggling with. So we have created a Jamboard, and we're going to be using this a couple of times throughout the session, and we're going to continuously put links in, but if you keep this open, you'll be able to page through to the different prompts. But we're using this rather than chat because that way we'll also be able to have a record of what people shared. So that way, and it's you can do it anonymously and be able to learn and grow off of one another. Excuse me. So please take a moment and add your thoughts. And we encourage you to do this by adding your own sticky note, which is we've sort of circled the icon so you can see what that looks like. To be able to type in your thoughts, and then you can move it to where you'd like to place it. I didn't realize there was a limit as to how many people could view the file. So please let me know if you have any issues.
Yeah, since apparently I don't get to view it. There it goes.
You all are on this. It's, but I will say some of you are writing things that are things that I know that I am too either struggling with or continuously learning.
Sorry. I was trying to recopy the link, but Juliann, do you have it handy? Somebody's asking for it in chat.
Oh yeah,
I got it.
Thanks,
there you
Rebecca.
go.
Only I forgot when in present mode, it's not going to let me copy.
I just want to take a second, say everyone is posting so much, and it is so clear that there are so many passionate, committed people who care about the people they manage and lead. And I just, wow, everybody. That's really affirming.
Yes. And I will also just say, like, I am reading some of these and think that many of you are maybe in my mind right now. But I think some of those things of, trying to figure out how to help and support others while also taking care of oneself. What do boundaries look like, both in terms of being like, if I am struggling, how do I also provide support for other people? And like, where's the line between being compassionate and then feeling like maybe people are being able to take advantage of that, and how do you balance, especially for those of us who are, the middle managers, like, how do you balance sort of supporting the people beneath you while answering to the people above you and setting those expectations and advocacy. So thank you all for sharing. For the sake of time, we're going to move on, but I continue to add your thoughts as you have them. And one of the things I will just note, Jennie, can you just sort of, if you keep this page up, at the top, you'll see that there's a 1 of like 4, I believe, at the top, or it's 1 of 7. Oh, but if you page through that, you'll see like later on in just a little bit, we'll get to those other prompts. So we're going to continue to use this, and we can put the links back in again as well. But if you want to just keep it open. So just to talk a little bit about our agenda for the day, we're going to talk, I'm going to sort of frame the session a little bit. And then some of the areas that we're going to talk about are about building trust, making space, and really translating to what comes next. And then we are going to do our best to provide at least 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. So we'll see how our time management skills go today. So a little bit about framing. Jennie, Rebecca, and I all work at the same institution. And I think even prior to pandemic times, had all been thinking about, our management styles. What is our approach? How is it that how do we want to lead? How do we want to support the people who report to us? And what type of world do we want to live in? It became really clear to us that we had to pay a lot more attention to this and be pretty explicit about it and review it constantly, because after the pandemic started, we also went through a library reorganization. So we had reporting lines change. We had our job descriptions change. We had to establish new supervisory relationships, while also recognizing that the ways that we had worked previously were no longer available to us. So there was a lot of adjustment, and I think we needed to make sure that we were leading from a place of compassion, but also recognizing that we also had to be compassionate with ourselves. And that first things first, we learned a lot of this the hard way, and we continue to learn it the hard way. So we definitely leads into the next point. Compassionate leadership is a practice, not an attribute. That it's a matter of we are consistently checking in. How is it that we want to lead? And oftentimes finding that support network where we can say, I want to be compassionate, but I'm having a really hard time being that way right now. Also want to note, care and compassion are highly gendered. And they are also enacted in a white supremacist society. So it's very much oftentimes about recognizing how they are expected to be performed and who should perform them. And we want to make an active case that these qualities and the related labor should be valued. But oftentimes we also recognize that not everyone will receive the same recognition for this labor. So we acknowledge that and are trying very hard to say that we expect these qualities and we encourage these qualities in all types of leaders. And mostly that we center them because it helps us build the kind of workplace we want to exist in. And I think that's one of the things of again, it's a practice. We continue to move forward. I don't think we ever arrive at a certain place, but how do we continue to build the place that we want to be in? And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jennie to talk about building trust.
So to start with, we're going to go back to our slides to sort of ask you, what are some of the actions you have taken to build trust in the workplace? So I'm going to flip back over to that slide. And we're going to do a reflection at the beginning of each of the frames, just so that people sort of have an idea of how we're hitting these. I see a couple being authentic, sort of sharing when you're struggling, sort of following through meetings. I too am a fan of walking meetings and look forward to being able to have them again at some point in the future. I'm seeing a lot of really great things here. So I'm going to switch back to slides, but I'll come back to these as we move forward. So one of the big things when we talk about trust is like, what is trust? I think often we're like, we know when we don't trust somebody, but like, why? Why don't we trust them? So Feltman, who wrote the Thin Book of Trust, has these 4 components that he defines as things that make you feel trust or build trust within an organization. He calls them sincerity, competency, reliability, and care. I think reliability and competence, I think, are 2 that you probably can define, but they're not big, they're not the 2 that are the focus in compassionate leadership. You need both of them. You need all 4 of these components, but when we're thinking about compassionate leadership, what we're thinking about are the 2 areas of sincerity and care. Sincerity, this can often be trust, like, are you honest? Are you authentic? Do you follow through on what you say? Care is, it's, do you honestly take in feedback, respond to that feedback, and reflect and show change, is one of the ways that you would start showing care. I think when we look at each of these, when I look at sort of go back over here to some of the great stuff you're throwing on the Jamboard, which you're still filling up. So thanks everybody. Like, I think, it's that, finding that transparency, finding the ability to know people, to really know what they're struggling with, what they're feeling, are some of the, sort of physical manifestations of these 4 categories. So one of the things, you've put down a bunch of strategies, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the strategies we've used in this past year. And one of them that I'm going to harp on, and then I think everybody else is going to talk about, is communication. I think one of the things that I feel I've really learned is that there is no such thing as too much communication when it comes to crisis and change management. You want to share until people tell you stop it. And you will find that the point that they say stop it is a lot farther away than you think it is. At the beginning of the pandemic, the Dean's office was actually putting out daily messages on what was changing every day. And we did that for about 2.5 months before people were like, you know what, we don't actually need one every day. And now we still do them twice a week. And so, and part of the reason you want to do it that frequently in that way is because often people don't hear it on the first pass out. Often when you announce something that is, you're like, this is big and this is important, it may not be important to that individual the first time you announce it, so they may not take it in. We're also all dealing with large amounts of information overload. There's communications coming from campus, there's communications coming with the libraries, there's communications coming out in the media and everywhere else. And it's just, there's a lot of information, and sometimes the first time it comes out, you're not going to hear it, and that's okay. I think a lot about that in relation to feedback as well. So I have worked through worked on the reference desk, back when there used to be desks, physical desks. And in our library, one of the most popular questions on the desk for quite some time was, where's the printer? And that first time the person comes up to you, you're on there for an hour, and at the end, you're like, 7 people have asked me where the printer is. But you need to be just as enthusiastic and like understanding to that 7th person as you are to that first one. And that's true in interactions with people. So if somebody's asking you a question and you've answered that question 17 times and you're sort of like, why do people keep asking me the question? Why couldn't they have taken this in? It's because your communication didn't hit them at the right time. And so you need to have that same compassion and care for the 17th time you're answering the question as you did the first. I think about this, our campus started doing monitoring tests for everybody coming on site. And as people came on later and later in the semester, like at a certain point in the semester, I'm like, doesn't everybody know how this works? But those people were asking that question then because it hadn't mattered to them at the beginning of the semester because they weren't here. And now they were coming on and they needed answers to the question. So sort of keeping that thoughtfulness and care in response to feedback, even if they're asking you the same question. And one of the other big things, strategies for sort of building trust, is also providing prioritization. So we haven't quoted Brene Brown yet, so I'm going to quote her. She's always saying, clear is kind, unclear is unkind. When you are talking to people in a crisis and change situation, it is helpful for them to know where you are going. If you do not provide large-scale prioritization, then everybody they're not only having to figure out the crisis, they're having to figure out, well, what should I be putting my energies into? And so providing that prioritization is kind. It helps everybody understand where you're going, and then they can trust that they are going in the right direction as well. So it is important to do all of that. I'm just going to pull up just because you all have been amazing. And I just want to show everybody how amazing everybody's been doing on this Jamboard. I also would say these are all some great strategies I see up here. Following through on actions. So when somebody asks you for something, sort of following through and giving them back, I think that's another great one. And Juliann, Juliann just shared the bit.ly again in case anybody came in late. Sort of acknowledging where, I think there's been a theme on this one and the last one on, sometimes the institution sets policies and you have to live within those policies, sort of acknowledging where you have power to make change and where you don't, is also another one that I wanted to highlight out there. So I am now going to pass this over to Rebecca.
Okay, so one of the other components when we were thinking about what worked as compassionate leadership was making space, whether that was emotional or literal time space. So this Jamboard, if you could, we'll drop that in, but if you could share on this next Jamboard page, what actions you've taken or experienced that made space for crisis in the workplace. And as folks kind of fill that in, let's maybe move into the next slide and then come back. But we really saw, when I really looked at what we did, there were kind of three components that effectively made space, and starting with triaging to create any space, logistical flexibility so that people could access that space, and reinforcement so people had the affective capacity to access that space. And all of these matter all the time, but the pandemic and the reorg really made it clear that we had to think about these things in new ways and really burst through kind of those barriers that we created or let creep in institutionally. So when we think about triaging in the next slide, I think we think about sharing a handful and just a handful of simple organization-wide priorities so that people can use to independently assess what's important and what's not. Like most libraries, we have a beautiful strategic plan with a lot of really important goals. And as soon as we hit this crisis point, it was really essential to strip them down. So we wound up stripping down to just kind of 3 primary priorities of adding people to cohorts for public spaces, because we do have some spaces open, improving contactless pickup, and providing quality student experiences. So having these 3 meant people could independently assess the importance of what they were doing, which meant that they had a little bit more autonomy and a little bit control over their own work. There were not everybody loved the priorities, not everybody wanted to be part of them, but it did mean that they could look at what they were doing and they could see how it matched or it didn't, which is really important. We also had a lot of explicit conversations about what's urgent and what's important and where there's overlap. Kind of throughout the pandemic and the reorg, right? There's a lot of there have been periods when what is urgent and what is important is completely overlapped. That Venn diagram is a circle. But things also backed up and backed apart. And so it was really important not to get trapped in that sense of urgency. So that if there was a quiet period, that we had a conversation about what was important right that moment. And that was really important for people to be able to balance their load, and so that we don't wind up going down rabbit holes that really don't matter in the long run. Because a big thing, right? You need meaning at work. That's part of finding yourself. And part of not burning out, right? If we look at like what causes burnout, that sense of a lack of meaning and a lack of autonomy are 2 of the big things feeding in. And we also had to have a lot of conversations about what to let go and what to say no to. And that meant to our users, which is a really big reframe for a lot of us. We're in the chapter of our library that focuses on public services. Most of us are really motivated by serving our users to the best extent possible. And in normal times, that often means saying yes. But in pandemic times, that meant saying no. You can't be in here right now. You have to put a mask on. It was very unnatural. So talking about that really clearly and setting expectations about what needed to happen and what didn't need to happen very clearly was really, really important to navigating that. And we had to say no to ourselves. So having to say, this matters to me personally, but there is no time. It has to go to the side. And again, if we go back to that clear is kind, it means nobody's wasting their time, nobody's wasting their effort. And it means that we're acknowledging the thing that's hard. So kind of next part of that, if we make this space, right, like we clear these expectations, but then how do we let people actually access this space? And flexibility is really key to that. We had some help in this. Our libraries had a caregiver recommendation pod, but when I looked at those recommendations, the thing that was just so impactful to me is that these recommendations matter to caregivers, but they matter to everybody. So, you know, setting expectations for asynchronous participation is essential if you're trying to do school and work at the same time, but it's also essential if you're a person whose job involves being on the desk. It helps everybody. And kind of a following is we discovered we really needed to set explicit, reasonable expectations for communication and response, especially since we were starting to depend on messaging teams, Microsoft Teams messaging. You have to be really thoughtful about how you do things like that, right? So thinking about when do we tag things so nobody misses an important message without spamming people so that it doesn't become everything is urgent. How do we remind ourselves that if we've said it's okay to wait, we have to actually act that. So it's not a situation where the 4 people who can answer right now have answered and the 5th person has a thought, but they couldn't answer for 5 hours and we've already made the decision. So it's really important to be clear to yourself and to each other about that. Also promoting participation however fits the person's situation. Letting go of whatever rules you have about it, right? Like camera doesn't have to be on, you don't have to talk, you can talk in the chat. There are all kinds of reasons for all of these possibilities. Our team members are adults, they know what they need, and what we want is participation. As a manager, especially right now, I don't really care how you participate, I just want to make sure that you can. And kind of the last thing that I think is really, really important and want to highlight is making sure that everyone is offered the flexibility equally. We don't want anybody to not get flexibility they need, and we don't want anyone to be in a position where they have to disclose things they're not comfortable with in order to be given that flexibility. And next slide, please. So we can make all this space, we can make it possible to access it. And then we need to make it safe for people to access it because, right, we're in academia. We work in a system that doesn't really encourage people taking space, and in fact often punishes them for it. So even if there's like, I think the Academy has started giving lip service to this idea of caring about the whole individual, but we haven't quite got there into practice yet. So if we as managers want to make that practice, you have to make it really explicit. You have to say it again and again, and you have to make sure that your structures support it. So, you know, I'm in a position of extreme privilege in my organization, right? I'm a manager, and I look at myself and I find it hard to believe that I can access this space. So how is a junior faculty member or a staff member who's worrying about layoffs, right? How would they believe it if I struggle with it too? So that means you need to say it and say it again and be ready to hear the question, because people ask questions for a lot of reasons. And sometimes they ask questions for reassurance, even if they've heard your answer, they need to hear it again because it goes against the grain. And people need to hear it from different roles and levels in the organization. I depend on our deans to say this and mean it, because if they didn't, it wouldn't be safe for me to encourage it. And I depend on the supervisors and managers who report to me to do the same. It really has to be widespread in order for it to be safe. And so in addition to kind of this encouragement, right, you have to look at what are the actual barriers preventing people. So is it fear? So yes, you can keep encouraging it, but folks on the tenure track, folks who might have more precarious employment situations, folks who are concerned about their evaluations, needs to be really clear that yes, we will write testamentary letters in your tenure file saying what you did, even if it wasn't your job description, that was important and it mattered and it was essential in this weird time. That yes, doing something that's different from your regular job, but is essential, we still need you. Even if your job changes, your employment matters and we'll keep you. For evaluations, making sure that what changes has been documented so that it comes back in the evaluation. You say, yes, you did a good job. You didn't accomplish any of these goals because pandemic. And I hope that sounds so obvious, but it's also really hard and people need to hear it explicitly. And then acknowledging that grief and not pathologizing negative experiences, because right, there's so many flavors of grief with this pandemic, like I can't even count them all. But even if it's saying your job has changed, your projects have changed, this thing you wanted to do for years and finally got set up and can't do now, right? That's grief too, and we need to acknowledge it. And we need to acknowledge that the way people's work lives have changed isn't necessarily positive right now. And I also think it's really interesting thinking about this in terms of honesty and transparency. I was just reading Catherine May's Wintering, and one of the quotes said, if we don't allow ourselves the fundamental honesty of our own sadness, then we miss an important cue to adapt. And I think that really lines up with what we've been talking about in terms of transparency. And it also lines up with what a lot of libraries talk about. in terms of innovation. And that's one of the things that is in our regular strategic plan, right? That we prioritize it. So if we're going to do that, then we need to be aware of our own cues and we need to be paying attention to our own selves. And last, I think asking and respecting that people know what they need. If someone is needing not to talk to you, if they are needing not to process their grief with you, then don't do it. You know, every one of the people who are showing up to work knows themselves. Next slide, please. And that kind of ties in with what to be aware of when you're doing this. And you have to take your own space and keep your own boundaries. It is no good for anyone for us to be acting beyond our capacities. I'm not a therapist. I can't provide people therapy. I can point them to it and I can acknowledge their feelings, but it is harming them if I step into that role. And that's so important to remember, I think, because it also gives you a little bit of space, right? You're not responsible for fixing everything. And it's really important to pay attention to your own self. You know, if you start hitting an empathy wall, if you start feeling, you know, why is that person complaining about that thing? It's not a big deal. Something else is way worse. Like when I hear my mental narrative shifting in that, I'm like, okay, I need to go find a friend. I need to go find my partner. I need to go take a walk. I need to hand wave and complain and get it over with so I can go back and meet that person in the space they're at. Because that's all any of us can do. That's the only place anybody can be. And it's also really important for us to think about our own gaps in awareness. You know, I'm in the pandemic as a parent, and that means I'm pretty aware of what it's like trying to balance childcare and work. But I'm also not aware of what it's like trying to balance, like I'm the parent of toddlers. So I have no idea what it's like trying to explain all of this to your 17-year-old kid. I have no idea what it's like trying to manage caregiving for an elderly relative that you're wholly responsible for, or an adult child who needs care, or the challenges of living alone in the pandemic, right? Everybody has their burden, and that's what is easiest to know. So really consciously looking at all the other difficulties and making sure I'm accounting for the ones that don't come automatically to mind when I'm thinking about making space. And kind of related to that is noticing when making space is making a pinch. Are you making so much space for someone that other people are having to haul a big load? Are you running into a situation where you just have to stop doing something? Like focusing on that, keeping an eye out for that can help you not squish anyone in your compassion. And I just want to take a look at the Jamboard before we transition into the next section. But I love some of these. I'm seeing flexibility, canceling meetings, totally optional meetings. It's okay if people cry. Yeah. As a person whose face sometimes leaks, I think that's pretty important. Staff check-ins for fun. Reassuring that it's okay to not do things when you're in a bad place, I think is so important. So much of this that I'm seeing is just making expectations and requirements really, really explicit. I love the one that just came up about designating low bandwidth projects you can chip away at when doing other things feel impossible. That's such a nice way of being able to feel like a forward progress when you feel blocked. Adjustments to goal setting, fewer goals, no stretch goals. The whole pandemic is a stretch experience. That feels pretty accurate. Yeah. Talking about the issues like racism and white supremacy. Yeah. Okay. Well, I love this, everything that's been contributed, and I think we're really well positioned to move into what we take forward.
Again, maybe I'll learn to unmute myself. So thank you, Rebecca. So I think one of the things is, you know, that this past year has taught a lot of us that certain things were not sustainable, and we already knew that they weren't sustainable, and that things were very weak ties, so to speak. And so I'm curious about what have you done over the past year that really you want to sort of take forward? Yeah, the person who just wrote, I love Zoom for consultations. I'm with you. I work a lot with business students who are often in teams, and it's so much easier to meet over Zoom. And I see a lot of things about like working from home, flexibility and scheduling. Zoom conferences so people can attend at a lower cost. Oh, being able to say no. Like, how is it like that we feel so frequently pressured to say yes to all of the things? And values and boundaries. Yeah. Please, I encourage you to keep contributing, but just for the sake of time, we're going to move forward. I think, you know, we are not the only ones who are thinking, what comes next? We have spent a year literally feeling like everything is on fire. And I know it feels oftentimes that everything is reacting and everything is, you know, how is it that we just make it through? It's all survival. And hey, we survived, like, and we continue to survive. But how do we, like, what do we want moving forward? So a few things that I just in this section want to touch base on is this idea of like, what does returning to work look like? For those of you who recognize that every place has handled this differently, some of your work might be the same, fully in-person classes, everything working as quote unquote normal. But then, and how do we think about shifting our expectations? And how do we implement some of the things that we've learned? So first is going to talk, Jennie, we can go to the next slide, about returning to work. I think sort of one of the things is not just to sort of slip back into what is normal, what existed previously. How is this also a chance for us to re-examine and reevaluate our priorities and consider the work environment that we want to foster? I think, you know, I know this has happened at our institution, that sometimes it's easy to say, well, it was worse before. So we should be really grateful for where we are now. And recognizing that you can both acknowledge and be grateful for that while wanting to continuously improve. We talk about this being a practice. And I think, you know, the compassionate leadership and, you know, building the world that we want to live in, it's not just you do a thing and it's suddenly great and wonderful, that it's going to be a continuous reevaluation and examination and implementing those pieces. I think like one of the other things that's really important is that paying attention to what was previously hidden and examine what continues to be hidden. And I think a lot of people sort of got to that in some of the prompts of this idea of like, who gets to work from home? Who gets flexibility? You know, what are those pieces? And how do we have that growth and reflection and that continuous change? I know some people wrote about boundaries. anyone who talks to me, and Rebecca hears this a lot, is that I really value a lot of the writing and work that Anne Helen Peterson is doing these days. I would, first of all, encourage you all to read her book, Can't Even, about burnout. But then also she's doing a lot of work right now around sort of the future of work and our work environments, and has talked a lot about shifting from boundaries to guideposts and shifting the responsibility not on individuals, but to the organizations. So that, you know, too frequently it's up to the individual to set those boundaries, but then how is it that, you know, do we say as an organization, what are those like guideposts that we expect for everybody around, especially when it comes to like flexibility, who gets to work from home? How do we make sure like people in sort of like upper levels oftentimes had a lot of flexibility around working from home, or where, you know, hours that they can work? How do we apply that to many other people while recognizing sort of the structures that we have to move forward and support? And I think, you know, also acknowledging what is and what is not under our control. I think sometimes many of us probably might want to burn it to the ground and start afresh. That might not be possible, but how is it that we can say, we have control over this? And we've had these conversations in our library. Again, we are not perfect, but we keep trying to improve. How is it that we can model, especially for other parts of campus, an environment that we want? So Jenny, can you go to the next slide? I was trying to figure out what to write on this slide, and then I realized that this is examines what it is that I was trying to get at, and the shifting of expectations for people, and how much we have expected to take on more, be able to do more, go higher, do more flips. And what are those expectations? And, you know, we oftentimes are asked to do more with less. What do we actually need to do? And how is it that we can set control over that? I will say for the tenure stream library faculty at CU, we recently revised our tenure standards, and it allowed us to really articulate what it is that we are asking for the different levels of our work. And I think it really helped recalibrate those expectations and situate it in a way you know, that will help people set up for success and not leave them completely burnt out at the time of tenure. And I think, how do we take that approach in other parts of our work? And hopefully I have not made anyone dizzy with this GIF, as it just is spinning over and over and over again. But again, just to sort of wrap up, is like, how do we implement these lessons learned? And how do we do so with being intentional about it? So I already talked about a little of these things, but you know, who gets flexibility? Who gets to do remote work? How do we make that applicable across the entire organization? And how do we sort of share that load and be clear about it? And, you know, who gets the trust and benefit of remote work? What is the point? And how is also like, what is the point of work in our lives? How is it part of our lives and not our entire lives? And then I'm sure many of us have had this moment of, oh, well, when we return to normal. When we return to normal, what is normal? Is that what we want? Is that what, like, who does that work for? And how is that reinforcing certain inequities, certain power structures that maybe this is a chance for us to challenge and adjust? And again, we probably won't be able to fix it all, but how can we make strides towards it? And I will say, you know, for me, one of the biggest things is this year has been a lot of reacting to things, even in trying to develop new supervisory relationships with people. It's been incredibly difficult to be intentional about that. And there have been lots of moments where, in order to be able to be compassionate to that person, I have had to turn around and find someone that I can vent to. I live alone, so sometimes that's my dog, but trying to find those people that I can have those conversations with, so that I can turn and take a deep breath and remind myself that everyone is coming at this from a different position, and that we're all struggling, and how do we help to move forward? So I really think that it's a chance for us to say, you know, commuting 5 days a week and being butts in seats at certain times probably was not working for all of us. And so how is it that we can make sure that we say we want to be able to contribute to the work that we do and engage, and provide success, but also what does that actually mean? And how do we articulate those pieces? Oh, look at that. Okay, so it's not quite 10 minutes, but close to 10 minutes. And yeah, we really want to move away from everything is on fire around us. So yeah, we would love to hear your questions, and I think we have a few in the Q&A.
Juliann, do you want to pick one and call on one of us, or how would you like to?
Sorry, I'm also watching because my neighbor is getting a delivery and I'm really hoping my dog doesn't start barking at it.
You want? So I'm assuming that means there's some dog excitement. So the most upvoted question we have is, I'm experiencing a total breakdown of trust with one of my reports. I only have 2 and soon one will leave, leaving me with just this person. I can't rely on them to do anything I assign because they so inconsistently do what's asked of them. And I try really, really hard to be a compassionate, clear, and communicative manager, but it's like this person doesn't care or doesn't want it. It's hard not to just be avoidant for mental health reasons, especially during difficult times. What do I do?
So I think compassionate doesn't mean compassionate at, like, that doesn't mean sometimes saying no is compassionate. Like, I think Rebecca, you were talking about, don't give one person so much space that nobody else gets space.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's also true if somebody is not performing, then you're actually punishing everybody else by not being clear that they're not performing is detrimental to everybody else. It sucks when somebody's not performing. Like, I think you go at it from compassion, but at a certain point, the compassion is, I understand that this is really hard, but what I really need and what everybody else in this organization really needs is for you to do the work. And if you can't do the work, then this is the wrong spot. And I don't know, Rebecca or Juliann, if you want to add more.
I was just going to add that I think for me, sometimes what I've had to do in these instances is step back and reframe to try to figure out, is it a matter of coaching? Is it a matter of like that they're facing certain roadblocks that are maybe their own like worst enemy? Do they are there other things that are happening in their lives that are preventing them from engaging? And so I think sometimes by addressing it from sort of side questions can sometimes lead to that deeper understanding, while also then like bringing up issues of, is this the best fit for you? Are you happy in this role? Is this the thing that you want to be doing, or do you need help connecting to something else? Because, agree, like it's not fair to other people, but I think sometimes it can signal that it might mean that something deeper is going on. And again, I will also recommend that it's not up to you to always solve all of those things, but how can you help connect them to resources that might help them solve those things?
The only thing I would add is just thinking about, like, if as the person who has to do the hard thing, there's all kinds of strategies for doing that, but I think depending on kind of your approach, Captain Awkward on the internet has some really nice pieces on how to do work that is hard or work when your mental health is suffering. And that might be a place to find some strategies. I know I always resort to self-bribery when there's something I really don't want to face. I felt silly about it for a long time, but sometimes, even if it's a really big, gnarly problem, having a stupid reward at the end will get me over that hump.
Somebody mentioned in the chat, ask a manager, which I love. Like, I read it and I go, oh, okay. It could be worse, like, which again, is not the, like, we want it to be better, but sometimes when I'm struggling, it is nice to read that somebody else is struggling as well.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that I like about that is, I think that site is that we've talked a lot in the conference and in the comments about problematic work environments people have experienced and kind of the long-term impacts that has. And Ask a Manager is kind of nice because you can like read that and calibrate and be like, oh, that is not what I experienced. Okay, there's other ways of doing things. You know, and yes, how to talk to your small child. I'm not gonna lie. The insight about asking questions over and over again because you need reassurance partly came from my 2.5-year-old. Like I knew that intellectually beforehand, but I don't know, when someone's hanging onto your leg, it was very clear to me then. The next question we have, next most upvoted question is, I'm concerned by how many administrators I hear talking about being compassionate versus how many I see / hear actually being compassionate. And that's fair.
Yeah.
That's real.
Yeah, that's real.
And I don't know what to say other than to try and walk the walk. You know, Juliann shared a podcast with us yesterday with Brene Brown on Adam Grant's podcast, which I've forgotten what it's called. But one of the questions was, what do you do if your manager isn't managing? And the answer was not to try and persuade them, but just to practice it, just to model it. The example was like a work project that had failed, and they were like, go to them and say like, oh, what if we had this conversation? Because I'm hearing these stories. Could we try this? Which isn't necessarily strictly fair, that it would be on you, but I thought it was a really interesting strategy.
Yeah, and I think a lot about what are sort of strategies for individual interactions. So how is it that I can say, help me understand, or, you know, like, and think about those specific instances. But then I also think about, when do I recognize that something is a larger structural pattern that also needs to be addressed, and how do I go about like working on that? And sometimes it's a matter of, you know, maybe you feel that you actually do have like I think this varies by organization, about an HR. Do you have like HR support that could actually be helpful? Do you have like a coalition that you could build of other people who are also experiencing the same thing, that you can then maybe move it up? So I think trying to think about what sort of is like an individual portion, and then when are you recognizing that this is a larger structural thing? But then also recognizing that sometimes like the way that our lives work is, you need your job for health insurance, you need your job because you can't move. So you like stick it out and try to figure out how to make it suck a little less. But hopefully certain strategies that we've talked about here today, but that in some of the resources also help addressing those.
Okay, so unfortunately, we are coming to the end of our time together. So I want to thank Jennie, Juliann, and Rebecca. Once again, this was an amazing presentation. Really appreciated, lots to think about here. We did record this session, so y'all can revisit it, and look forward to seeing you at our next and last round of breakout sessions in about 15 minutes. So thanks, everyone.
And everybody, I just put my email in the chat.